Okay, last week we left off, we were still on chapter 2 in Joshua. We got a lot done, but there's a couple little things that I wanted to finish up in chapter 2 before we move on to chapter 3. So in chapter 2, as you recall, we have the story of Rahab and the spies. And after she expresses her wonder and amazement at God's greatness and her confidence that it is God who will make sure that Israel succeeds and they will indeed capture the land, she wants to be saved. She wants to put her lot with the Jewish people, in essence. And we have, first of all, we have her, she's asking to be saved. And in the meantime, she lowers them by a rope. This is in verse 15. She let them down by a rope through the window. And while she's there and they're down below, she tells them to go off to the hills, make for the hills so that the pursuers may not come upon you. Stay there in hiding for 3 days. And then the men then tell her, the spies, they tell her that she needs to tie a scarlet thread from the very same place, that very same window where she has just let them down. And he says, anyone of your family who you want to save with you, you must bring them into the house. None of them can leave. And only after, you do that, if you do that, you don't tell, on the one hand, you don't tell anybody, about our little plan here. And number 2, you make sure that you don't leave the house at all. You just leave that scarlet thread. Then we will come and save you. Okay, and that's what she does. She tells them that. Now, picture the scene, though. Okay, as we said, she's in this house that's in the wall of the city, in the wall of Jericho. So this window that she's letting them down is basically a window in the wall. And by letting them down through the window, she's essentially letting them down outside the city, just outside the wall. And from there, they can escape. Now, this image of a woman at the window is an image that we see in a few other stories in the Bible. First of all, can any of you think of any other ones? A woman at the window. A woman at the window. Does anybody have any? Can any of you remember an incident? You can unmute yourself and say.
Sisera's mother.
Sisera's mother.
Sisera's
Excellent.
mother.
Sisera's mother. Who else? Anyone else? A woman at the window. There are 2 others. Jezebel, right. And a third?
Michal.
You got it. Okay, everybody passed the test. Great. Okay, so what I would like to do now is take a look at these, it's 4, it's Rahab plus these other 3 women, all of these women at the window. And let's see if we can find some kind of common ground between them and of course differences as well. So let's start, we're going to go chronologically. We just did Rahab. Let's go. The next one is Sisera's mother, and that's in the book of Judges. If we look at Judges chapter 5, Judges chapter 5, verse 28. Now this shows up in Deborah's song, in her song of Thanksgiving after the whole story. And you may recall the story here is Deborah, who is the leader. She is the prophetess. She is the one who encourages Barak to go forward to fight this fight against one of the last vestiges of the Canaanites in the land of Canaan. And Sisera is the general who's leading the Canaanite army. And in the end, the Canaanites are defeated, and Sisera himself is killed by Yael, who is this woman in a tent. That's a whole different thing. Women in the tent. That's for a different class. Where do we find the women in the tent? Now we're doing the women at the window. Okay. And so in this beautiful poem of Thanksgiving that Deborah has, she doesn't just thank God, but she kind of paints a picture. And she paints a picture of what it looks like on the other side. And you have the women, well, first of all, she is praising the woman, Yael, who, thanks to her, Sisera is dead. But then she goes on to talk about another group of women, and these are the women of the Canaanite camp, first and foremost, Sisera's mother, who are there waiting and expecting their men to come back with victory. And instead, of course, they're not going to be coming back with victory. So what does it say? Here we have 28, through the window peered Sisera's mother. Behind the lattice she whined. Why is her chariot so long in coming? Why so late the clatter of his wheels? The wisest of her ladies give answer. She too replies to herself. They must be dividing the spoil they have found. A damsel or two for each man. Spoil of dyed cloths for Sisera. Spoil of embroidered cloths. A couple of embroidered cloths round every neck as spoil. Now, we don't have the rest of the story, but the rest of the story is obvious. Sisera is not coming back. The army is defeated. And this woman who's going from looking out the window, anticipating victory and her son coming back as a hero, will indeed get her son back in a body box, if at all. Okay, so what you're seeing, though, is the woman standing inside the home, looking outside, expecting salvation, expecting victory and salvation, okay? Which, if you think about it, what we're talking about with Rahab is very similar. She, first of all, she becomes an instrument of salvation for the spies. She takes them out through the window, okay, on this rope, allows them, helps them down on this rope through the window, where they will then go to their salvation. And yet, when the nation of Israel comes back, she will be sitting inside at the window where she has put this scarlet thread, anticipating salvation for her that will come from outside. So salvation is always outside the window, and the person inside the window is anticipating or affecting some kind of salvation, okay? And that, of course, is also very relevant to Michal, who is David's wife, David's first wife. And we see that in the book of 1 Samuel, chapter 19. And this, of course, is right at the beginning of this conflict between David and Saul, where David is already seeing Saul is not happy with him. And Saul has already decided that he wants to kill David. David kind of knows about it. And meanwhile, he needs to get away. Michal is Saul's daughter and David's wife. So she is in a very difficult position, in many ways not that different from Rahab's position. Okay? I mean, Rahab is not married to these spies, but Rahab is in a situation where she is a Canaanite and her loyalties should lie with her family, with her people, the people of Jericho. And yet she makes this decision to align herself with Israel, and in so doing, takes these two men and gets them out the window with a rope where they can go off and be saved. Michal is facing a very similar conflict, far more personal conflict than Rahab. It's not just, again, from one people to the next. It's her father and her husband. And her father wants to kill her husband. She's really in an impossible situation, but she makes her choice and she aligns herself with her husband. And so, let's see, I would start with verse 11, chapter 19, verse 11. Saul sent messengers to David's home to keep watch on him, to kill him in the morning. But David's wife, Michal, told him, unless you run for your life tonight, you will be killed tomorrow. Michal let David down from the window, and he escaped and fled. So again, we have the same situation. Michal is up there in the window, just like Rahab. It doesn't say that she put down a rope, but that's the understanding. A rope, a ladder, something that she puts down from the window, helps David climb out the window, out to his freedom, to salvation, but she remains there in the window, okay? And indeed, she does remain. She remains in the window, so she makes a very interesting choice, Michal. Michal is one of the most tragic figures. You know, it's a woman I have enormous sympathy for. she chooses to save her husband, but not to go with him. She doesn't leave her father. She tries to kind of, take it both ways. So she helps her husband to safety, but she stays behind. And of course, ultimately what happens, Saul marries her off to this other guy. And then when David becomes king, he takes her back. She's in a horrible place, a horrible position. And I think that's in a way represented by the fact that she stays in the window. She takes David out to saves him through the window, but she remains in the window. Whereas Rahab helps these two fellows to safety through the window, but then she waits in the window and they come back and get her. She ends up leaving the window also and joining those two men and the people of Israel, which brings her ultimate salvation. Okay. And the final character is the really most unsavory of all. It's Jezebel. Also a woman at the window. Jezebel, this is in 2 Kings chapter 9. And Jehu is the guy who has been sent by God, by Elisha, to kill the king of Israel and to take over. Okay, Joram is the king, and Joram is Ahab's son, and he's the king. And basically, what God is doing is getting rid of Ahab's total dynasty and starting a new one through Jehu. And Jezebel is still around. And so we have in verse 30, Jehu went on to Jezreel. When Jezebel heard of it, she painted her eyes with kohl and dressed her hair, and she looked out of the window. She's a very, very proud woman, and she's going to come here. Even though she knows she's in danger, she is going to present a very proud and haughty position, very arrogant. As Jehu entered the gate, she called well, "Is all well, Zimri, murderer of your master?" He looked up to the window, toward the window, and said, "Who is on my side? Who?" And 2 or 3 eunuchs leaned out toward him. "Throw her down," he said. They threw her down, and her blood splattered on the wall and on the horses, and they trampled her. So here you have another woman at the window gazing out, but instead of anticipating salvation, what she is anticipating realistically, she's actually anticipating what Sisera's mother should have anticipated, what Sisera's mother ended up getting. Sisera's mother's in the window expecting salvation, and she gets tragedy and destruction. Jezebel is looking at the window, knowing that Jehu is on his way because he has just killed her son, and so, but she remains her haughty, arrogant self. She is going to go with this pride to her death, and at the end, the window, she leaves the window by being thrown out the window, not to her salvation, but rather to her death, and not just death, but a very nasty, death that is not just there. The horses don't just trample her physically, but trample whatever was left of her honor, and that's certainly the point of the story. So I just think it's very interesting because I think we have the same visual picture, the woman at the window, and this is not an accident. I think when you see these kinds of images, repeating themselves in different stories, and all of them have a similar situation, a woman at the window with some kind of a dialogue with this idea of salvation. And as I said, Jezebel, of course, realizes what her end is. Sisera, it does not realize what the end is. And Michal makes a choice to provide salvation to David, but not to join him. But when we come to Rahab is really a beautiful story. What we saw with these other figures, they are all tragic. Michal, the mother of Sisera, Jezebel. Now, we don't have so much patience or sympathy for Jezebel. We have limited sympathy for Sisera's mother. We have enormous sympathy for Michal. Okay, they're all tragic figures in one way or another. And then there's Rahab. There is absolutely nothing tragic about Rahab. And perhaps what distinguishes her from the other women is that not only, as I said before, not only does she enable the salvation of these two men, but she herself makes a very, 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 very definite decision. And her decision is, I'm going to join the people of Israel. So that the window becomes not only a vehicle to save these two men, but it becomes her own vehicle of salvation, because unlike Michal, she too will go through the window and she will join the Jewish people. Now, the end of the Rahab story is actually in chapter 6, at the very end of chapter 6, in between chapters 3, 4, and 5, and 6, we have stories having to do with the preparations for and the actual battle of Jericho, which we will go through. But the happy end, of course, with regard to Rahab, is in chapter 6, verse 25. Only Rahab, the prostitute, and her father's family were spared by Joshua, along with all that belonged to her. And she dwelt among the Israelites, as is still the case. For she had hidden the messengers that Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. So here, the scripture makes it very, very clear that she had a happy ending, okay? She was spared, her family was spared, and they were the only ones that were spared. And the reason they were spared, they were kept alive. And it's interesting, the word in Hebrew, in English, it says they were spared. Spared meaning saved, okay? That kind of thing. But really, the word in Hebrew is hechaya. Hechaya literally means brought to life. Rahab was not just saved, her life was not only preserved, her life was renewed, okay? And there's a sense here in the fact that she decided to come and join the Israelites. She gets a new life. And indeed, for someone who was a prostitute at the very bottom of society, she does this, she has this amazing religious, spiritual recognition of God, and that enables her to take a very strong stand, to do a very brave act in saving these men. And then she is going to be saved herself. As she joins the nation of Israel, she becomes a new person. And as I mentioned last week, I know that Christian sources see Rahab as someone who is an ancestor of Jesus, I believe, which means somehow she married into the tribe of Judah. Jewish sources see her as having married Joshua himself, who was of the tribe of Ephraim, but of her descendants were priests and prophets. So if they were priests, somewhere along the line, one of her daughters or granddaughters would have had to marry a priest, and that is how they would have had priests. But in any case, she's certainly seen both by Christian and by Jewish sources as being a woman who comes from the bottom and rises up to be at the very, very top. And that's really a very, very special thing. So with that, we have completed chapter 2. And now I'd like to go on to chapter 3. Chapter 3 is actually very complicated. And I think the complicated part of it, we're going to have to wait till next week. We'll see. We'll see how far along we get. But we'll start with an easy part of chapter 3. Okay. Chapter 3, let me just introduce it as follows. Chapter 3 is and chapter 4, which continues directly from it, all talking about the preparations for the conquest of Jericho. These are complicated chapters because they seem to be very out of order, okay? And so we're going to be discussing that a little bit, but before we get to that, I'm going to just start with the first few verses, okay? Early the next morning, or Joshua rose up, and all the Israelites traveled from the Shittim and marched to the Jordan River, okay? They did not cross immediately. They spent the night there. 3 days later, the officials went through the camp and charged the people as follows. When you see the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord your God being borne by the Levitical priests, you shall move forward, follow it, but keep a distance of some 2,000 cubits from it, never coming any closer to it, so that you may know by what route to march, since it is a road you have not traveled before. And Joshua said to the people, purify yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will perform wonders in your midst. Okay? So one of the things I just want to focus on here is the 3 days. Okay? We have in verse 2, after 3 days, at the end of 3 days, and then we have this story about these police or these officials going amongst the camp and giving kind of a sort of pep talk to the nation about, that they'll see the ark being borne by the priests and the Levites, and that they have to first of all be very careful not to get too close to the ark, and then, of course, beginning this idea of you're about to do amazing things. You're about to experience amazing things. Okay. Now, this theme of 3 days is something we've already seen just in these first few chapters in Joshua. First of all, in chapter 1, when we did chapter 1, we talked about 3 parts of chapter 1. The first part was the repetition over and over of the, be strong and courageous. We have a comparison with Moses, and we have God's words to Joshua to give him encouragement and build him up. That's the first section. The third section, the last section, is about the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and the half tribe of Manasseh, and how they have a dialogue with Joshua. And again, they are saying to him, if you are the leader and God is with you, then we will follow you. Okay. In between that is these 2 little verses that we didn't spend very much time on at all, but I want to review them now. This is chapter 1, verse 10. Joshua thereupon gave orders to the officials of the people. Go through the camp and charge the people thus. Get provisions ready, for in 3 days' time you are to cross the Jordan in order to enter and possess the land that the Lord your God is giving you as a possession. So Joshua in chapter 1 is already assigning these officials a job. He's saying you're going to have to go through the camp and tell them in 3 days we're going to cross. Be ready. 3 days we're going to cross. Okay? Now, in chapter 2, we see that the 3 days, and I think we're talking about the same 3 days, okay? 3 days figures prominently in the story of these 2 spies and Rahab. First of all, in chapter 2, verse 16, when they came to her, let's say in the afternoon, it's evening, the king finds out, and he sent men to find them, and she's hiding them, and then she's telling them how to escape. And she says, make for the hills so that the pursuers may not come upon you. Stay there in hiding 3 days until the pursuers return, then go your way. And indeed, that's what they do. In verse 22, we see they went straight to the hills and stayed there 3 days until the pursuers turned back. And so the pursuers searching along the road did not find them. And then in chapter 23, we learn that they actually come down out of the hills, cross the Jordan, go back to the camp and report to Joshua. So I'm assuming, okay, because chapter 2 begins right after this dialogue of chapter 1. They're right there. They're about to cross. Joshua says to the officials, in 3 days, you're going to have to do this. The spies go over to Jericho, get found out right away, spend 3 days in hiding, and come back. So it's during those same 3 days that 3 days pass, and now the officials are about to, charge the nation with their instruction. And it could be it's 4 days, and it could be it's 5 days, because we didn't give any time for the spies to get to Jericho. We didn't give any time for them to run back from Jericho. So let's assume it's not 3 days, it's 5 days. And yet we have the same amount of time. And there's something in the Bible that there's a concept called archetypal numbers. There's certain numbers that you will see used over and over in the Bible that usually, I'm not saying that it wasn't, very often I think the Bible is not necessary. You'll never have unusual numbers unless you're counting something. But in other words, the Bible is never going to say in 4.5 days or 5 days or 6 days or whatever. It's almost always going to be 3 days, okay, in this kind of situation. Why? 3 days is an archetypal number for getting ready, for preparation. And in fact, this idea is also carried very strongly in Jewish tradition. For example, at Mount Sinai, okay, if you pay attention to what's going on right before the revelation at Sinai, okay, and we have Moses being given instruction. You're going to go up, you're going to go down, etc. And all this time, there's a certain instruction to Moses. Moses himself is getting ready for revelation, but he's also preparing the nation. So in Exodus 19, okay, verse 11, we have the following. Let's start with verse 10. And the Lord said to Moses, go to the people and warn them to stay pure today and tomorrow. Let them wash their clothes. Let them be ready for the third day. For on the third day, the Lord will come down to the sight of all the people on Mount Sinai. There's this idea that they're preparing themselves for 3 days. And on the third day, there's this amazing thing that's going to happen, which of course is the giving of the 10 commandments, the revelation on Mount Sinai. And actually in Jewish tradition, these 3 days before the holiday of Shavuot, Pentecost, which celebrates the revelation on Sinai, those 3 days we call the 3 days of preparation. And it's a time when it's considered already, kind of almost holiday. Okay. We commemorate it even to this day, not just the day itself, but the 3 days of preparation. And so what you can see here is also here is they're getting ready. I mean, don't forget, this is not just getting ready for a battle. This is getting ready to enter the land of Israel. We're talking about the ultimate fulfillment of what God first promised to Abraham. This is a monumental occasion. And so again, we have this idea of 3 days, which the 3 days itself is saying it's a time of preparation for a monumental event. In the same way, the revelation at Sinai was a monumental event. And if you think about it, it's that event that ties the nation of Israel to the God of Israel forever. This monumental event will tie the nation of Israel to the land of Israel forever. So it too has its own 3 very special days of preparation. Okay, so when we go into the rest, I'm going to just pose one question now, just as an introduction to what we will be doing next week. So you saw I read the first 5 verses, okay? And then we have as follows. In verse 6, Joshua said to the priests, carry the ark of the covenant and advance to the head of the people. And they took up the ark of the covenant, marched at the head of the people. Now look at verse 7. The Lord said to Joshua, this day, for the first time, I will exalt you in the sight of all Israel, so that they shall know that I will be with you as I was with Moses. For your part, command the priests who carry the Ark of the Covenant as follows. When you reach the edge of the waters of the Jordan, make a halt in the Jordan. Now, this is the question, and a question we will see in several times in chapter 3 and chapter 4, okay? Where we have Joshua doing something that after he does it, God commands him to do it. In verse 6, Joshua commands the priests, and God commands Joshua to command the priests only in verses 7 and 8. How is that possible? How is it that Joshua commands the priests before he got now, it's one thing to command the priests, and it's not something that God is going to command him about. But if God is commanding him to do something, it makes a lot more sense if God's command to Joshua comes first, and then Joshua fulfills the command and tells the priests. We see this situation 3 times in the course of chapter 3 and the beginning and chapter 4. Read them, think about it. This is what we're going to be doing next week. We are going to pulling this apart. And in fact, I'm going to redo the chapters. Don't worry. Nothing, desecrating here. But I think it's going to be an interesting exercise, and I hope you will enjoy it. But again, that will be for next week. Now we can open up if anybody has comments, questions. Happy to hear them now.
Marvelous teaching.
Thank you. Thank you. Anyone else? Yes, Diane.
Sondra, I'm sorry I missed last week and I haven't had time to check it out. So maybe you talked about this, but in the very beginning of chapter 2, when he tells them to spy secretly, and then it seems almost as soon as they went into the city, they were discovered,
right,
and sent after. And I thought, well, doesn't sound as if they were very good spies.
Well, they probably weren't very good spies, but what I did mention last week was as opposed to Moses, who sends a delegation of 12 men marching through the land. They certainly weren't secret spies, and their purpose was not espionage. Moses' spies were really not spies. They were there to kind of just, hear the lay of the land and figure out what's going on. These two guys really do sneak into Jericho. They do, but I think the king's spies are just better.
Okay.
So they just get found out better. But we did a much more detailed analysis of this whole situation last week, and I would encourage you to listen to that tape if you have a chance, Diane.
Yes, I will. Thanks.
Okay. Anybody else? Yes, Liz.
Michal is looking out of the window as well when she sees David as he's bringing the covenant into Jerusalem.
Oh, yes, you're right. Absolutely. And that is such a wonderful contrast. She looks out the window. By this point, she's been forced back to David after she has been with Paltiel and does not want to be David's wife. It would be already his second wife, and he's not, he is the first wife, whatever. She has only derision for him. Her father has already been killed. Her brother is dead. The kingship has moved to David, and she's full of scorn for David. And I think that's such a tragic ending to the Michal story. It's her own tragedy. It's a tragedy of her own making, in a way that she didn't leave the window with David, and now she's stuck in that window, incapable of connecting to David. And I think that's part of what's going on there. There's such hostility there that she expresses to David, and David is no fan of hers either at this point. When he forces her back, and I'm very uncomfortable with what David does in forcing her back to him. It's almost as if he's doing it as taking royal prerogative or something. But on the other hand, maybe it was something he needed to do to ensure that his kingdom was, in those days, a king is a king. There's not a democracy. You don't get voted in and out. You're not looking. You have to establish your authority. And he had to establish the fact that Saul's family is gone. And so it could be that he needed to ensure that Michal was under his roof and not somewhere else where she could pose a possible challenge. That's politically something that I might, I could suggest. But clearly, it's a very sad story when he forces her back. And so there's no love lost on either side there between them. But that's a wonderful point, Liz. Thank you for bringing that up. Okay, so this was good. Next week, get ready. And if any of you want to start, teasing your brains a little bit, go back and read 3 and 4 and see 3 different times when it seems God's instruction is written after Joshua has already done what God has said to do. Okay, we'll discuss that in detail next week. Have a great weekend, a great week, actually. Now we're on Mondays. I kept to remember we're not Thursdays anymore. Have a great week, and we'll see you again next week.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Sondra. Thank you, Sondra.
Oh, thank you. So good to see you, Richard.
Yes, thank you. And we look forward to next week. And I look forward to when you remind us that when Joshua went into the land, that included Judea and Samaria. And we got to be reminded that is part of Israel.
Not just part, it was the main part. Jericho is into the Jordan Valley. It's Judea and Samaria, 100%. Thank you for reminding me, Richard. I will make sure to focus on that as well. Thank you. Okay, bye, everybody.
I hope you enjoyed that video. And we'd like to be sure you're getting all of our video content. So just click on the subscribe button below, as well as on the notification bell. And that way you will have easy access to all our material. We look forward to staying in touch with you. God bless you, and have a wonderful day.